One, she was still there. She didn't leave him. That was the cruel part. She was still there, still sleeping beside him, still answering, still smiling when she had to. But somehow, she was already gone. And he didn't notice the day her love stopped reaching for him. He thought the silence meant peace. He thought the distance meant maturity. He had no idea he was watching the slow death of something he still believed was alive. Subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, because the next part is where the silence starts telling the truth. 2. The quiet shift. It didn't happen all at once. That's what made it invisible. There was no argument, no slammed doors, no moment you could point to and say, "That's where it broke." Instead, it softened, and then it thinned, until it was barely there. She still said, "Good morning." But her voice no longer reached him. She still asked about his day. But she stopped waiting for the answer. At dinner, she nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, but her eyes, they had already stepped out of the room. He noticed the quiet, of course he did. But he misunderstood it. He thought, "We've grown. No more fights, no more tension. Just calm, just space, just ease." What he didn't see was that she wasn't choosing peace. She was withdrawing. There's a difference. Peace still leans in. Withdrawal slowly disappears. She stopped correcting him when he forgot things that once mattered to her. Stopped asking twice. Stopped trying to be understood. And the most dangerous part? He felt relief. Relief that things were finally easy. Relief that she no longer needed so much. Relief that he didn't have to reach further than he was comfortable. But ease can be a disguise. Sometimes, what feels like less pressure is actually less connection. Her messages became shorter. Her laughter quieter. Her presence lighter, like it was already preparing to leave. Not physically. Not yet. But emotionally? She had already taken a step back. Then another. And another. Until one day, the space between them wasn't something you could close with a conversation. Because she had stopped asking for one. And he kept thinking, if something was wrong, she would tell me. But she already had. In all the ways he never learned to hear. 3. The pattern he ignored. At first, it looked like nothing. That was the danger of it. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, nothing anyone outside the relationship would have noticed. If you had seen them together, you probably would have said they were fine. Still sharing a home, still moving through the same routines, still looking, from a distance, like two people who simply had a quiet kind of love. But quiet love and disappearing love are not the same thing. The pattern began in places so small, they were easy to dismiss. She stopped sending the second text. If he forgot to reply, she let the conversation die. If he said he was busy, she said, "Okay," and meant it in a way he didn't understand. Not angry, not needy, just done reaching. She no longer tried to pull warmth out of someone who only offered it when it was convenient. She stopped repeating herself. The little things she once explained gently, what hurt her, what made her feel alone, what she wished they could fix, she no longer brought them up. Not because they stopped mattering, but because she had learned the unbearable math of disappointment. Saying it twice hurt more than saying nothing at all. He mistook her silence for healing. That was the lie he told himself. He thought, maybe she had become stronger. Maybe she had stopped overthinking. Maybe they were finally past the difficult phase. He never considered that her quiet wasn't proof of security. It was proof of surrender. And surrender has a pattern. First, a woman stops asking. Then she stops explaining. Then she stops hoping. And long before she ever leaves with her body, she leaves with her expectations. That was the part he ignored. Not because he was cruel, but because the truth would have required him to look directly at himself, to admit that love cannot survive on occasional attention. Half listening, and delayed tenderness, that being physically present is not the same as being emotionally available. So he kept living as though the absence of conflict meant the presence of love. While she kept adjusting to life without being fully seen. And every time she grew quieter, he relaxed more. Every time she asked for less, he gave less. Every time she retreated, he called it peace. Until the pattern became a wall. And by then, the most painful part was no longer that she felt alone. It was that she had learned how not to need him there. For the moment he felt it. He didn't feel it when she cried. He didn't feel it during the quiet dinners, or in the shorter texts, or in the way her eyes stopped searching his face for reassurance. Back then, all of it still felt explainable. Stress, exhaustion, life. He had a reason for every distance, a name for every silence, anything but the truth. He felt it on an ordinary night. That was what made it unbearable. No storm, no accusation, no final fight sharp enough to blame. Just a room filled with the kind of stillness that should have felt peaceful, but didn't. He walked in expecting the familiar shape of her attention, the small glance up. The soft, hey, the invisible thread that used to reach for him before words ever did. And it wasn't there. She looked at him. But she did not light up. She answered. But she did not open. She stayed. But somehow, she was no longer with him. For the first time, he felt the absence without being told. Not as drama. Not as punishment. As fact. Cold, simple, devastating fact. Something had left the room long before either of them did. And now there was no way to pretend he couldn't feel the temperature drop. It hit him in the smallest moment. He said something half-hearted. Something that usually would have earned at least a tired smile. She nodded politely, as if he were someone she respected, but no longer reached for, as if intimacy had been replaced by manners. That was the moment. Not when she yelled. She never did. Not when she threatened to leave. She didn't. It was when her kindness no longer carried closeness. When her gentleness felt formal. When he realized she had stopped bringing her real self into the room because the room had stopped feeling safe for her heart. And suddenly, everything he once called peace looked different. It wasn't peace. It was exhaustion. It was grief that had run out of language. It was love that had knocked too many times and finally learned to stand still. He wanted, in that instant, to rewind everything, to ask the questions he should have asked months ago, to hear the versions of her pain he had interrupted, minimized, or waited too long to answer. But regret is cruel that way. It arrives fully awake only after connection has gone numb. So he stood there, feeling the weight of what had changed. Not because she was gone, but because he could feel, with terrifying clarity, that she no longer expected him to come closer. And once a heart stops expecting, it begins surviving without you. 5. Naming the wound. He wanted a single moment to blame. A sentence, a mistake, something clean enough to point it and say, that's where it broke. But there was no single fracture. No dramatic betrayal. No obvious villain. What happened between them didn't explode. It eroded. Quietly, repeatedly, almost politely. And when he finally stopped searching for a moment, he had to face a pattern. Not hers. His. It wasn't that he didn't care. That would have been easier to fix. It was that he only showed care when it didn't cost him anything. He listened. But only halfway. He showed up. But rarely with his full attention. He loved. But in ways that stayed comfortable for him. And over time, she learned something painful. She wasn't asking for too much. She was asking the wrong person to go deeper than he knew how. This is what emotional unavailability looks like. Not cruelty. Not absence. But limitation. A quiet ceiling you keep hitting, no matter how gently you try. She reached for connection. He offered presence. She asked for understanding. He gave solutions. She needed closeness. He gave space and called it respect. And the more she adjusted, the more invisible her needs became. Until even she started questioning them. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe love isn't supposed to feel this lonely. But loneliness inside a relationship isn't confusion. It's information. It tells you that something essential is missing. Not in effort, but in depth. And depth cannot be negotiated into someone who hasn't learned how to stay present inside discomfort. That was the wound. Not that he didn't love her. but that his love stopped at the edge of himself. And she kept standing there, waiting for him to cross a line he didn't even know existed. 6. When it becomes you. And this is the part where the story stops being about them. Because at some point, it turns, quietly, almost invisibly. And the person listening no longer hears his silence or her leaving as someone else's pain. They hear themselves. Maybe not in every detail. Maybe not in the exact words. But in the feeling. In the exhaustion of trying to explain something that should have been felt without translation. In the humiliation of needing warmth from someone who keeps offering distance and calling it normal. In the strange loneliness of sitting next to someone you love and still feeling emotionally unattended. That's when it becomes personal. Not because the relationship looked dramatic, but because it looked familiar. You remember the version of yourself who kept minimizing the hurt. Who kept saying, "They're just tired. They've had a lot on their mind. This is just a hard season." You remember how long you kept protecting their intentions while betraying your own feelings. And maybe that's the deepest wound of all. Not simply that someone failed to meet you, but that you learned to abandon yourself while waiting for them to arrive. That's how these stories repeat. Not through one catastrophic moment, but through small acts of self-erasure. You stop bringing things up because you don't want to feel difficult. You soften your needs so you won't feel too much. You tell yourself you're being patient, mature, understanding. But underneath all of that is a quieter truth. You are adapting to emotional absence. You are learning how to survive on fragments. And survival can feel noble for a while. It can even look like love. Until one day, you realize how much of yourself has gone missing just to keep the connection from collapsing. That is the moment the story changes. Because now it's no longer about whether they meant to hurt you. It's about what their pattern has taught you to accept. It's about the nights you went silent to keep the peace. The mornings you woke up heavy and called it overthinking. The ache you carried without naming because naming it would force a decision. And suddenly, the real question is no longer, why were they like that? The real question is, why did I stay in a place where I kept disappearing? That question is harder. But it's also the beginning of truth. Because the moment you recognize yourself in the wound, you stop waiting for someone else to explain your pain back to you. And that is where quiet power begins. 7. Too late to fix quietly. By the time he finally reached for her, he did it softly, carefully, almost respectfully, as if gentleness could undo what distance had done. He asked more questions. He came home earlier. He tried to listen longer. He noticed the details he used to miss. The silence in her voice. The pause before her answers. The way she smiled without warmth. As if kindness had replaced closeness. And for the first time, he understood something terrifying. Quiet damage does not always look urgent until it's irreversible. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't angry. That would have been easier to fight. Easier to fix. Easier to name. What made it unbearable was how calm she had become. How finished. She no longer needed a dramatic goodbye. Because part of her had already left long before this moment. Not in one violent break, but in 100 small disappointments he had mistaken for normal. So when he finally tried to repair it, it didn't feel like rescue. It felt late. That is the grief no one talks about, the pain of realizing your effort arrived only after her hope was gone. The ache of becoming emotionally available only when the other person has stopped waiting. Some endings do not explode. They settle, quietly, permanently. And maybe that's why this hurts so much. Because deep down, many of us know what it means to wait too long, to say too little, to notice too late. If this story felt uncomfortably familiar, share it with someone who may need these words. Tell me in the comments, was it distance, silence, or timing that broke it? And if you want more stories that name the emotions people usually hide, like this video, and subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast.